Hello. On behalf of the Utah Marriage Commission, I would like to welcome Dr. Ofa Hafoka-Kanuch back to the show. Dr. Ofa is a licensed clinical psychologist and provides therapy both in private practice as well as through BYU counseling and psychological services. She specializes in performance and sports-related stress, anxiety, depression, trauma, eating disorders, perfectionism, and racial minority stress. She also teaches courses in positive living and performance psychology at BYU. Dr. Ofa will be presenting today on the topic of navigating cultural differences in marriage. We have set aside the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's 1-hour webinar for an anonymous Q&A session. So feel free to jot down your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature has been disabled for this live webinar, so make sure you put it in the Q&A and write down if you want to have your question be anonymous. Also, this workshop is approved for 1-hour continuing education credit, so please complete the survey at the end of the webinar to receive your certificate. We'll turn the time over to Dr. Ofa. We are so pleased to have you with us again.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I am going to share my screen. Is that working?
Yep.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I am just getting over a cold, so my voice sounds and feels a little hoarse. I'm just going to mute myself if I have to cough or sneeze or anything. But I am really excited and grateful to be here to talk about navigating cultural differences in marriage. I welcome participation through the Q&A. So if you have questions or comments as we're going, feel free to submit that. Let's get started. Okay, I first want to start off with a couple of quick acknowledgements. First, I want to acknowledge the land of which I'm on, which historically and traditionally belongs to the Ute, the Paiute, the Shoshone tribes. I started this webinar the last time that I was here with this quote that I really appreciate from Maya Angelou. I come as one, but I stand as 10,000. And my opinions expressed in this presentation are my own, not those of my employer or anyone else. And I'd also want to acknowledge the Utah Marriage Commission for not only this webinar, but the regular webinar presentations that they offer and the other resources that they offer as well. I just want to first start off with some intentions that I have for this webinar, but also hoping that you may have similar intentions as well. I hope that you can listen and attend for this 1 hour with your full self. I hope that you can be challenged to think outside of your comfort zone. And I hope that the session can translate into deeper, more enriched empathy and understanding in your relationships, specifically in your marriage. I really appreciate this definition of cultural humility. Cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby us as individuals we not only learn about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of our own beliefs and our own cultural identities. This is where I want to start off. First by a little exploration of what our cultural values are, and then we'll get into navigating differences when they come up in our relationships. I just want to give you a couple of seconds to grab a piece of paper or a notebook that you can take notes in. I'm going to do a couple of activities that I want you to reflect on as an individual, and then we'll come back and we could talk about some questions or some things that might come up.
Dr. Ofa?
Yes.
Your slides are not progressing. There you go.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's so weird. Okay. So let me just go over the culture humility. It's a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of our own beliefs and our own cultural identities. If you can just grab a piece of paper or a notebook that you can write in. I want to do an exploration. I want to start off with 10 values that shape cultural differences. This was created by a professor, David Livermore of Michigan State University. He studies cultural intelligence in understanding and adapting to different national cultures. He describes 10 value polarities that in some combination can be used to define and understand a particular culture. And I'll go through each of these. And as I go through each one, I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to reflect on where you stand and so far in your experience with your partner, where your partner might stand in some of these cultural values. The first one is identity, and this is individualist versus collectivist. This is the degree to which personal identity is defined in terms of personal individual characteristics versus group collective characteristics. Individualism is organized around protecting the rights of the individual, whereas collectivism is organized around what's best for the collective or the group as a whole. I just want you to jot down some notes where you fall, kind of like on a spectrum, but where you fall in terms of individualist or collectivist, and where your partner might fall. Is the slide on 10 values that shape cultural differences? We're going to be on this slide for a while.
It is.
Okay. So number one, individualist versus collectivist. Number two is authority. And this is low versus high power distance. And I can explain what that is. This is the amount of hierarchy and inequality that is assumed to be appropriate and normal within a culture or society. In a high power distance culture, independent behavior is not encouraged. Individuals are expected in the high power culture to defer to authority based on age, relationship, class, or position. So where do you fall in terms of low versus high uncertainty avoidance? And so far, if you're not with your partner right now, so far, what have you observed in your partner? Number three is risk. This is low versus high uncertainty avoidance. This is the degree to which most people within the culture tolerate risk and feel threatened by uncertain, ambiguous circumstances. Cultures that are high on uncertainty avoidance index are anxious about unpredictability and ambiguity. These cultures prefer stability in their lives and also in their careers. They want their environment to be predictable. Based on your culture that you come from, where are you in terms of low versus high uncertainty avoidance? The next one is achievement, cooperative versus competitive. Cultures that are more oriented around being cooperative place a priority on nurturing, supportive relationships. Whereas cultures that are more oriented around being competitive are more focused on achievement, success, and results. And although these options are pretty polarized, I believe that we fall somewhere on a spectrum. So where do you fall? Number 5 is punctuality versus relationships, long-term versus short-term orientation. People from cultures in North America, Western Europe, and other developed nations around the world organize themselves around clock time, while most other cultures around the world function using event time, which means that time is not set to be exact start or end times for events, but as approximate guidelines. So when it comes to punctuality or time, where do you fall? Do you follow clock time or event time? Number 6 is communication. And this is direct versus indirect or high versus low context. Low context culture takes very little for granted in communication. Things are explained explicitly and directly, and little is left to subjective interpretation. There's very little emphasis on using the context to interpret the meaning. In a high context culture, communication presumes an understanding of unwritten rules and a shared narrative that informs a person of what's going on. It's not necessarily assumed that people mean what they say and say what they mean. So a lot of open for interpretation, whereas a low context culture is very direct. Number 7 is lifestyle, being or doing. Should time be spent primarily on being productive, or is it more liberally dispersed across various obligations in life? For example, in the United States, there's a strong emphasis or a culture around doing or being productive, and organized around performance and achieving results. And so in your lifestyle, are you focused around production and measuring that production, or being present, being mindful? Number 8 is rules, particularist versus universalist. In universalism, there's rules for everyone. There's an obligation to adhere to standards that are universally agreed to by the culture in which the person lives. Everyone adheres to the same rules in this culture. With particularism, there's particular obligations to the people we know. For example, someone else is not just a citizen of our society. If they're my friend, then I believe that I must sustain, protect, or defend this person, no matter what the rules say. Number 9 is expressiveness, neutral versus affective. The key to understanding the culture dimension, known as neutral, is the way that we express emotion, not whether we feel emotion, but how is it expressed in our culture. Neutral cultures see control of feelings as a sign of respect and dignity, while affective cultures believe that emotions should be displayed openly. So how are emotions, how are they expressed in your culture? And then the last one is social norms. The strength of social norms. So in a tight social norm, the strength of social norms, how clear and pervasive the socially preferred perspectives and behaviors are within a society, and the strength of sanctioning, how much tolerance is there for deviance from the norms. So in a tight social norm, there are rules that everyone has to adhere by, versus a loose social norm where they allow people within the culture to deviate. Where do you fall? I want you to look over some of the notes or comments that you've put down as I went through the 10 values. I just want you to put a star next to your top 5 values. Is it time? Is it identity? Is it communication, lifestyle? From your experience in your own life, I just want you to put a star next to your top 5 values, cultural values, based on this list. Of course, you're going to have other cultural values. And if, as I was going through that, you thought of specific cultural values that you have, I just want you to include that too. And then I want you to circle based on your top 5. I just want you to circle your top 3. And as I go through the rest of my presentation, I want you to think about and reflect on how do you uphold your cultural values in your relationship, and what differences do you have with your partner in your relationship when it comes to cultural values. So as we talk about navigating our differences, it's really important that we first identify what personal cultural values do we have, and then I'll talk about how to navigate those differences. First thing that, these are more cultural values that I won't go through just due to time. The first thing that I want to talk about is implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? We all have implicit biases. Implicit is meaning, by implicit, I mean the thoughts and feelings that we have are that we're unaware that we have. Bias, right? We have a bias when rather than being neutral, we have a preference or aversion to people or a group of people, even behaviors. We have a bias when we have a preference or aversion. And implicit bias when we have attitudes towards people or associate stereotypes with them or without our conscious knowledge. Everyone has implicit biases. Implicit bias also looks like making a lot of assumptions that we use to jump to conclusions. I want you to just take a second to think about what has been your implicit bias about your partner's culture. And when I talk about culture, not only am I talking about like ethnic racial culture, but also like family culture, religious culture, even just like their background, education, socioeconomic factors. There's a lot of ways we can define culture. But as you think about your implicit bias, what has been your assumptions about your partner's culture? And as you're thinking about that, I want you to think about, where did it come from? What influenced your thoughts about your partner's culture? I also think it's important to note that even if you come from similar cultural backgrounds, you can still have differences in your expectations, your practices, your traditions that you want to continue to perpetuate within your relationship. So don't think that because you have similar backgrounds that you won't have implicit bias as well. So where did your biases, where did your assumptions come from? Who or what influenced the way that you think about your partner's culture? Anytime we talk about culture, I think it's really important that we also define cultural humility. There's 3 parts. First is that self-awareness. Engaging in self-reflection, self-understanding, similar to the activity that we just did, helps to develop an accurate sense of self. As you reflect on your different identities, social identities, you can have a better understanding about what influences your worldview. I think it's also really important that when you try to develop cultural humility, or when you're also build awareness around like historical factors that may have impacted a specific group of people, especially when people that we care about and love identify with those identities and those populations. So being aware of and sensitive to historical realities like history of violence, oppression, discrimination against certain groups of people helps to build cultural humility. And then a third part of cultural humility is valuing others. And I'll talk about this in a second, but demonstrating a willingness to learn about your partner's culture. It's not anyone else's responsibility to educate you about their culture, about their identities. That's something that you can do on your own, especially as an act of love in a relationship. And you can still be curious about their experience, their personal experience. But educating yourself about an entire culture, that responsibility falls on you. And you can still ask your partner to share what their personal experiences have been. So when it comes to navigating cultural differences in your relationship, I think that's the big question here. We've spent some time exploring what your cultural values are, and I'll come back to that list in a second. But I think it's really important in relationships to practice curiosity, not judgment. So when it comes to how do I navigate differences when differences come up, and this is not if cultural differences come up, but when you're in any relationship, especially in a marriage, it's not a matter of if differences come up, but when. I think it's important to normalize that. But how do we navigate cultural differences? One thing is to be curious and not to be judgmental. And this is why I bring up implicit bias. We all have biases. We all have assumptions and stereotypes that we've even previously thought of. And so recognizing that, being aware of that, helps us to build curiosity and to choose curiosity over judgment. Curiosity looks like a willingness and an openness to learning from your partner and to learning a different culture, learning about a different culture. Curiosity is also leaning into difficult questions and responding from a place of genuineness and authenticity. Curiosity also means offering compassion when we make mistakes or when we say something that had a negative impact on someone, even though our intentions were good. Curiosity means that we are still offering compassion to ourselves when that happens, but also to our partner. Compassion also means expressing empathy and understanding. Also, it's okay to admit when you're wrong, and it's okay to admit when you've made a mistake. I had a previous professor in a course that I took on couples counseling say that it's often important to ask ourselves, do we want to be right or do we want to be married? And when it comes to navigating through differences, it's really important that we acknowledge and admit when we're wrong, especially when it comes to trying to preserve, save, and strengthen the relationship. So practicing curiosity, not judgment, is one of the first things that we can do. when we're navigating cultural differences. The next slide I want to, let me make sure. Okay, the next slide I want you to go back to that list of the cultural values that we explored. And I want you to draw a circle. So a smaller circle like the core circle, the inside circle that I have, and then a bigger circle around it, which we'll label as the flexible area. So the core, in the core, I want you to write down the ideas, the needs, the values that you would prefer not to be flexible on. This is an activity from the Gottman Institute, which is a really good resource for marriage and couples counseling. But the core, something that you prefer not to be flexible on. And I didn't want to label that as inflexible because I don't think it's helpful for us to identify things that are like non-negotiable or inflexible when we're talking about navigating differences. So something in the core, I just want you to go through the values. And if you need a place to start, refer back to the 10 values that we just, that you jotted down notes about. So what are the values that you would prefer not to be flexible on? And then based on the 10 values that we went over, what are other values that you feel like you could be flexible on when it comes to establishing a strong relationship in your marriage? So identify core values and then flexible values. So an example would be a core value is authority. So authority is something that I would prefer not to be flexible on. As in, like I don't want to, if I identify as a low power individual, then I would just want to share authority within my culture or within my family or relationship. And then another core value that I could be more flexible on is probably time. If I am a punctual person and I know I could be flexible on time, and that could be a flexible area. So as you are identifying what your core values are and what other the flexible values might be in your relationship, I want you to also just note, and you might not be with your partner now, but these questions might be helpful for you to discuss with your partner. And this is to be discussed not in a time of conflict, but when you're both in the right frame of mind to talk about what you would like to establish in your relationship. So some questions that I feel like would be worth reflecting on and discussing together include, can you help me to understand why your core needs or values are so important to you? What are your guiding feelings here? Like what are the emotions that you're feeling here? What feelings and goals do we have in common? And how might these goals be accomplished? Help me to understand your flexible areas. Let's see which ones we have in common when it comes to flexibility in our relationship. How can I help you to meet your core needs and your core values? And what compromise, whether this is temporary or something that we can work on long term, but what compromise can we reach on our differences right now? So exploring with your partner what your values are, what each of your core values are, and what each of your flexible areas are is a really, really important discussion to have. And then I want to spend some time. I only have about 10 minutes before we open up for question and answer. But this is where the work happens. It's in the compromise and the collaboration with your partner. This is where and how you navigate differences, cultural differences in marriage. One part of this is practicing effective communication. Your partner is not a mind reader. You are not a mind reader either. If something is really important for you, especially if you both differ in terms of communication, if you come from cultures that where one values indirect communication and another values direct communication, it's really important that you speak up, at least to your partner, about something that is bothering you or something that doesn't feel right for you. When I talk about communication, just very briefly, I want to note that your tone, your delivery, how you deliver in your tone, and the timing matters. When you would like to bring up a big difference in your marriage and you would like to compromise and collaborate, it's really important that you set aside time to do so. Sometimes it's really helpful when a partner can say, hey, this is something that's bothering me, and I want us to find time in our week to talk about this. This allows your partner to prepare, and it's almost always never helpful to catch someone or to catch them off guard or to blindside them. So pay attention and be intentional about your tone and your delivery, and then set aside time to have a conversation where you can both talk and listen to each other. As you go through some of the activities that we've already done, exploring what your culture values are, and then talking about areas of flexibility, it's also helpful to make room and space to create your own tradition. No culture is perfect. And sometimes we have that bias where we come from a cultural background where we feel like everything worked really great for us. But when you're integrating into a marriage or into a committed relationship, make room to create new traditions. And sometimes that compromise means taking parts of your culture and changing that to better fit your relationship. So make room for new traditions, even if it means that you're letting go some of the traditions and some of the ways that you practiced those values while you were in your upbringing. As I mentioned briefly before, apologizing and a genuine apology is really important as you're navigating differences. Conflicts will happen, and I think that's a pretty common and normal part of any relationship. But when you find out that something that you've done has had a negative impact, even though your intentions were really good, it's important that you take ownership and accountability and responsibility for what you've done. And part of that is apologizing when you are in the wrong, when you need to take that kind of accountability. So apologizing when you need to, and reaching an agreement. This is even just a temporary solution. If there's something that we can agree on right now, that's important. And even just agreeing that this is a temporary solution for now until we find something that better works for our relationship. So reaching and finding a solution that you both can agree on. When it comes to compromise, I think that sometimes we have to give and take when it comes to compromise. So it's not that one partner will feel, sometimes they might feel like they have to give up something for something else. And I think that's where the agreement has to happen. And then I think it's also really important that when you are trying to compromise and collaborate with your partner, if you've reached a point in your relationship where a mediator or an intervention might be really helpful, seek out couples and marriage therapy. You can actually benefit from couples therapy at any point in your relationship. You don't have to wait until a crisis happens or until you're at the brink of separation for you to seek counseling. If you need help figuring this stuff out, this is what counseling is for. Okay, I just want to open up now for questions and for comments. I want to know like if you did any of like those activities, what was helpful for you, what your reactions are, all of that. I tried to leave more time this time than last for questions. I think I could stop sharing my screen now. There we go.
Dr. Ofa, are you able to see the chat, the Q&A that just came up?
Oh, let me open it up. Should I just read it as they come?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Cool. Okay, so here's an anonymous question. Any ideas of simple resources to start better educating ourselves on culture for any relationship? I think it depends on, I think as you're in a relationship with someone from a different cultural background, start there. I think it's really important to have a basic knowledge of what their culture is. Ethnic, and I'm talking about ethnic and racial culture. I think start with like the history of that culture and the traditions. And then you can start to personalize what has this looked like specifically and how has this impacted my partner. But I think it depends on the specific culture of your partner. I think that's a good resource. So in terms of like any simple resources, I don't know of a general resource where you could start. I think part of when I talked about things that you can do in your relationship, most of that came from the Gottman Institute. And I think they do a really good job of providing education and resources for partners navigating differences in general. And I think working on communication and cultural humility could be a good start. And the Gottman Institute has really good resources for that. So I also have another question. This material seems relevant to couples with similar backgrounds. not just couples with different ethnic and racial backgrounds. I was surprised by how differently I ranked my spouse and I on 10 values. What are your thoughts on applicability to all couples? So what I really appreciated about the 10 cultural values list that I went through was that it was applicable. I think that when we're talking about culture, ethnic and racial culture is just one part of your identity. And a lot of people, even from similar cultural backgrounds, like I mentioned before, can still have differences in the values that they not only grew up in, but the values that they still want to continue to have and practice in their relationship. And so I think even just looking up the 10 values culture list and going through that with your partner, if you didn't have the chance to already, could be a really good place to start talking and start that dialogue on what are our personal cultural values, but then what differences have come up in our relationship. Okay, so Benjamin Bailey, I really appreciated the activity where you had us consider where we would fall on the spectrum of differing cultural values. I think that is an important aspect that often we do not consider. What suggestions do you have for decreasing defensiveness when you feel your intentions are not understood in conflict? I think defensiveness is a natural reaction that we often have, but defensiveness often gets in the way of having a productive, even reaching a productive solution to the conflict. I think finding the right time to talk about differences, even if it's scheduling time. And as you start to notice what defensiveness feels like in your body, if you start to get hot or heated, or you're not listening to your partner, those are pretty common signs that you are starting to be defensive. I think it's really important to take a break. And when you take a break, decide that this is no longer productive, that we need to come back to this at a different time, so that we could regulate our bodies and have a conversation where both of us could feel like we are being heard and understood. So taking a break when you start to be defensive could be really helpful. And then not just taking a break and going to do your own separate things, but taking a break with the intention that you both are going to think deeper about these things and then come back. So setting a time to come back, and it doesn't have to be the same day, but if you can decide that you're going to come back and talk about this again, especially because if your intentions are good, even if they're good, sometimes it could be harmful to your partner. So coming back at a different time when you can both feel a little bit more like regulated in your body, so that you could have a productive conversation. Question. I want to know more about people with cultures different from my own, but I'm worried that if I ask in the wrong way, I might offend them. How do I navigate that? I think that is a really important question for us to talk about. And I welcome answers as well in the Q&A because I want to know what your thoughts are on this. I think when it comes to issues of culture and race, we will all make mistakes. I think it's important to normalize that. And when you make a mistake, it's also really critical that you acknowledge that the mistake was made, and that you take responsibility and accountability. So you acknowledge and you admit, that even though that wasn't the intention, that you still offended someone. I also think that before you ask people, that you can try to educate yourself before asking people to, because it's not anyone else's responsibility to educate you. So even just doing a general like even just looking up general things about a different culture before asking, hey, and then I think even just asking with curiosity. So hey, this is what I've learned so far about your culture. Can you tell me what your experiences were? Or can you tell me if that was accurate for you? I think that could open up a conversation with curiosity. And so asking an open-ended question, recognizing when you've made a mistake. And I also think even just making explicit what your intentions are. That my intention is to learn more about your personal experience, while still acknowledging that it's not your responsibility to have to educate me on everything there is to know about your culture. But I do think that it's important that we normalize that everyone's going to make mistakes. And it's through those mistakes that we learn and that we grow. And when you learn that you've made a mistake, then that's when you can improve, so that when you're talking to this person or talking to your partner again, that you know how to ask things in a more sensitive way. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you for including a e-prep course that's offered for free in Utah. They give specific tools and examples on how to handle conflict. It's actually through the Stronger Marriage Commission. I have half of a question, but I think it got cut off, or maybe it was sent too early. Do you think a person's implicit bias? So if you sent me that question, please send me the rest of that question. Okay, here we go. Do you think a person's implicit bias is one of the leading causes of conflict, not just for couples, but for others, racial, gender, etc.? Yes, I do think that when we fail to acknowledge what our implicit biases are, that often will lead to conflicts. Because everyone has implicit bias, like I mentioned before. But because it's influenced by the way that we were raised or the environment that we were raised in, whatever it was, it's easy to overlook that bias. And so without doing the work on exploring and acknowledging and identifying what our implicit biases are, I think it's easy, going back to the defensiveness that we talked about. I think it's easy to get caught up in being defensive when we fail to acknowledge that we actually had biases or assumptions or stereotypes that we believed in when it comes to conflict with couples. And this is outside of culture as well. I think that there's a helpful assessment that you can do for implicit bias it's through Harvard, but it's online. If you just Googled Harvard implicit bias assessment, I think that's a good place to start if you are wanting to explore and identify what some of those biases are for you. Another question. You say it's our responsibility to educate ourselves on other cultures, but we often don't know what we don't know. I think that's true. How do we encourage cultural sensitivity within our circles of influence in gentle ways? I think that as things come up, so as people say things that are really offensive, I think it's important, and it's partly our responsibility to bring to their awareness that what they said was insensitive or offensive, or even just inaccurate. And so, even as we go throughout our day and we're interacting with different people, when we can point out, and it doesn't have to be in front of everyone, but even just privately, when we can point out that what they did was insensitive or harmful, I think that's how we start to change, and that's how we start to raise awareness of cultural sensitivity in the small circles that we have influence over in. And so I think that as a society, we have a long way to go when it comes to cultural sensitivity, but also in our everyday interactions, we have many opportunities to bring to awareness to other people when they're doing something that could be harmful. I think going back to what I mentioned about tone matters, and timing matters. So is this the right time? And I think that when it comes to calling someone out on something that they've done that's offensive, it's never the right time. And so you have to, unless you create time to have this discussion, it's never going to feel convenient. And so being intentional with your tone and your delivery, being gentle in that way and being compassionate in that way, and still creating time to talk about this. I hope that answered your question. This probably doesn't apply as much to couples, but I think we need to be careful to not lead with questions about people's culture when we have just met. It has been helpful for me to have general empathy for the fact that many folks from marginalized populations often are asked a lot of questions about their culture. This has the potential to make people feel like an outsider, and can be just tiring. Once you know someone well and trust their ability to set boundaries, you can ask if they're open to telling you about their own experiences and perceptions of their culture. Thank you for that. I think that in this specific webinar, we were talking about couples, right, in marriage. But I do think that in general, it's really helpful when we can have a strong relationship with someone, especially from a marginalized population, before we ask them to open up about their culture. I think it's also helpful when we can acknowledge that culture means something different to a lot of people. And to many people from marginalized populations, it's a really personal part of their identity. And so, like Benjamin mentioned, like having building that trust first before asking if they're open to telling you about their experiences could strengthen your relationship with people. Any last questions or comments before we close up? Okay, I think we're good to wrap up. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm recovering from a cold, so I apologize for muting myself when I had to cough, but I really appreciate the participation and the questions and comments that people gave throughout. Kirsten, there you go.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here. It is kind of cold season, so we're kind of all in that. So thank you so much. I learned so much from this webinar personally, even though my spouse and I are from similar cultural backgrounds. I just really felt like it was relevant information. So we're excited to share this with our audience and make sure that other people get to see it. On behalf of the Utah Marriage Commission, I also want to thank our audience for their participation and remind them that they can view previously recorded webinars on a variety of relationship topics, as well as Dr. Ofa's first Stronger Marriage webinar, which was on coping with race-related trauma, which I just watched again recently and is just really excellent. And you can visit our website at strongermarriage.org to watch those. Whether you are requesting a CEU or not, please be sure to complete the survey as you log off. This allows the Utah Marriage Commission to continue offering the webinar series and other relationship resources free of charge. Don't hesitate to email us at marriagecommission@usu.edu with any questions, and have a great night and a happy holidays. Bye now.